click to subscribe. I've got some breaking news. It's kind of a last-minute episode that I'm throwing together because of this information that I've been able to confirm.
Three names keep appearing together in discussions surrounding the Nancy Guthrie disappearance: Sheriff Nanos, Tommaso, and Annie Guthrie. Not because investigators have publicly accused them of working together. They have not. But because, according to people following the case closely, the timeline surrounding all three individuals contains overlaps that some observers believe deserve closer attention. And now, according to reports surrounding recent investigative coverage by Brian Entin, those overlapping details are once again becoming part of the public conversation. Tonight, we are going to carefully examine those reported connections, look at what is publicly known, and separate confirmed information from speculation. Because in investigations like this, timing matters. Relationships matter. And sometimes, what draws attention is not a single dramatic discovery, but a pattern of small details that continue resurfacing. Mapping the geography of her neighborhood, identifying who she interacted with in the immediate 48 hours prior to her disappearance, and evaluating whether early warning signs were overlooked by local authorities. This is standard procedure in the wake of a sudden disappearance. However, as weeks turned into months without a definitive breakthrough or forensic discovery, the investigative aperture naturally began to widen. When a case stalls, experienced investigators look beyond the victim's immediate circle and begin analyzing the broader operational landscape. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, this analytical expansion led observers, and eventually independent investigative journalists like Brian Entin, to look closely at a triad of names that continue to surface simultaneously in public records, online forums, and community discussions. Those names are Sheriff Nanos, Tommaso, and Annie Guthrie. It is vital to state clearly and unequivocally at the outset that law enforcement agencies have not issued formal indictments or publicly accused these three individuals of conspiring together or engaging in coordinated criminal activity regarding Nancy's disappearance. The connection between them is not based on an official theory of prosecution. Instead, it is based on something far more clinical: the mathematics of a timeline. When independent observers and digital forensics enthusiasts began overlaying the individual movement logs, phone records, and public statements of these three individuals, they discovered a series of overlapping nodes. In investigative methodology, an overlap occurs when multiple individuals connected to a case occupy the same temporal or geographic space during critical windows of interest, or when their subsequent actions show a high degree of correlation. The renewed focus brought to these overlaps by contemporary reporting has forced a re-examination of the early days of the case. It forces us to ask whether these intersections are merely the byproduct of a small, tightly knit community dealing with a crisis, or if they represent something requiring deeper institutional scrutiny. To understand why these three names are linked in the public mind, we must examine the specific roles they occupy within the broader environment of the investigation. Sheriff Nanos represents the official institutional response. As the primary law enforcement authority during the critical opening phase of the search, his administrative decisions, the speed of his agency's deployment, and his protocols regarding evidence preservation dictate the parameters of the entire case file. Annie Guthrie and Tommaso represent the personal and social sphere surrounding Nancy, occupying spaces where personal dynamics, historical relationships, and localized movements intersect with the timeline of the disappearance. In high-profile investigations, a recurring phenomenon often occurs where public discussion accelerates far ahead of verified forensic evidence. This presents a distinct challenge for analytical reporting. The frequent repetition of names in community spaces can create a false perception of culpability. Former homicide detectives and missing persons experts frequently point out that overlapping timelines can look incredibly suspicious on paper, while remaining entirely coincidental in reality. In any given town, the daily routines of citizens and local officials will naturally cross paths. The core objective of timeline reconstruction is not to manufacture a narrative of guilt based on these crossings, but to test them for internal consistency. We must ask a fundamental question: do the statements provided by these individuals match the hard logistical data generated by their digital footprints and physical movements? According to insights gleaned from recent investigative journalism, the primary discrepancies drawing the attention of observers involve the mechanics of early communication. Specifically, the inquiry centers on who initiated contact with whom, the precise timestamps of those communications, and how those interactions align with the official window of Nancy's disappearance. In the first 48 to 72 hours after a person vanishes, communication patterns are highly telling. They reveal the true reaction times of those involved and establish a baseline for what individuals knew and when they knew it. Online analysis of the case has highlighted several persistent inconsistencies. Some of these involve slight variations in verbal statements delivered to different media outlets over time. Others involve physical location logs that do not perfectly align with the recollections of peripheral witnesses. Furthermore, a significant point of contention involves differing accounts of what transpired during the immediate, frantic days after Nancy was reported missing. While local authorities treat these variances as typical human error, amplified by a highly stressful situation, seasoned investigators view them as areas requiring rigorous clarification. The public role of Sheriff Nanos has remained under intense scrutiny, primarily due to the specific administrative choices made during the first week of the operation. A primary critique raised by external observers involves the latency period between the initial missing person report and the formal request for assistance from specialized outside agencies. In complex missing persons cases, the utilization of state or federal assets, advanced forensic teams, and specialized search technology is often time-critical. Decisions that delay the onboarding of these resources can permanently impact the integrity of a physical search grid and the collection of volatile digital evidence. Simultaneously, the public focus on Nancy Guthrie and Tommaso intensified as observers began constructing detailed relationship maps. In forensic analysis, relationship mapping is used to chart the hidden networks of communication, influence, and proximity between individuals connected to an event. When these maps were generated using publicly available data from the Guthrie case, observers noted that the communications between Nancy Guthrie, Tommaso, and the administrative circle of the Sheriff's Department formed a dense cluster during the exact periods where Nancy's whereabouts became unaccounted for. Experienced timeline analysts emphasize that the goal of reviewing these records is to identify stability over time. When an individual provides an account of their movements during a crisis, that narrative should remain rigid when tested against cell tower pings, surveillance footage, and financial transactions. When a narrative begins to shift, even slightly, it flags a zone of interest for investigators. It is within these specific zones of interest that the names Nanos, Tommaso, and Nancy Guthrie continue to meet. As we conclude this first phase of our analysis, the evidence does not point to a definitive, wrapped-up conclusion. It points instead to an incomplete puzzle, where the pieces have been cut, but do not yet sit flush against one another. We now transition into the second phase of our examination, moving deeper into the structural mechanics of the timeline, the specific pathways for public cooperation, and the long-term implications of unresolved investigative data. If you are just joining us, we are conducting a systematic review of the overlapping timelines involving Sheriff Nanos, Tommaso, and Nancy Guthrie within the broader context of the Nancy Guthrie disappearance. Our objective is to understand why these specific intersections continue to command public interest years after the initial event, and how modern investigative techniques interpret these patterns. When we look closely at long-running missing persons cases, one truth becomes clear. Time alters the nature of an investigation in profound ways. In the immediate aftermath of a disappearance, the public conversation is driven by urgency, emotion, and rapid-fire media updates. Years later, that emotional noise fades, leaving behind a cold, static archive of documentation. This is the stage where analytical timeline reconstruction becomes the defining factor. It allows investigators to step back from the emotional weight of individual statements and look exclusively at the structural geometry of the case. A major theme running through contemporary coverage of the Guthrie case is the concept of consistency over time. Former detectives note that human memory is an imperfect recording device. Under extreme duress, honest witnesses will confuse dates, misremember times, and alter peripheral details of an event. This is an accepted psychological reality within standard law enforcement protocols. However, a clear distinction must be made between benign memory degradation and structural shifts in a core narrative. If the fundamental elements of an individual's timeline change, such as their physical location during a critical hour or the sequence of phone calls they made, investigators are forced to reevaluate the reliability of that entire data set. In the public sphere, the reporting of journalists like Brian Entin has resonated because it treats the case not as a theater for dramatic accusations, but as a series of unanswered operational questions. This approach focuses the viewer's eye on the gaps in the institutional narrative. For example, why do certain communication logs between individuals close to the case remain unverified or omitted from early public briefings? Why did the administrative response follow a specific path that critics argue insulated certain timelines from immediate, independent validation? These questions are not born out of speculative fantasy. They are the logical result of analyzing a public record that contains clear omissions. To fully comprehend the ongoing interest in Sheriff Nanos, Tommaso, and Nancy Guthrie, we must look at how modern digital forensics utilizes relationship mapping. In the modern era, an individual's life is tracked by a continuous stream of data: geolocation pings, automated license plate readers, bank transactions, and encrypted messaging timestamps. When investigators build an axis where time sits on one side and geography sits on the other, they can plot the exact movements of everyone involved in a case with surgical precision. When this technique is applied to high-profile cases, it often reveals that individuals who claim to have minimal contact were actually operating within the same localized digital grid. In the context of the Nancy Guthrie matter, the continued public scrutiny regarding Tommaso's specific timeline positions illustrates this dynamic clearly. The exact nature of his movements and his interactions with peripheral figures during the initial search window remain a subject of intense online debate. When an individual's role within a critical timeline is left ambiguous or inadequately explained by public updates, the vacuum is invariably filled by public speculation. This is why transparency from leading investigative agencies is so vital. When official channels fail to provide a cohesive, logical timeline that accounts for all key actors, the public narrative fragments, ensuring that the same names will be revisited indefinitely. Furthermore, we must evaluate the institutional responsibilities borne by leadership during the genesis of this case. Sheriff Nanos operated within an ecosystem where early decisions carry permanent consequences. Experts in forensic pathology and criminal investigation frequently write about the golden hours, the first 3 days of an investigation where physical evidence is pristine and logic dictates the highest probability of recovery. If scene security is compromised, if witness statements are not recorded immediately and separately, or if the digital footprints of suspects and victims are not preserved via immediate legal holds, the foundation of the case becomes structurally compromised. The persistent criticism directed at the early phase of the Guthrie investigation centers entirely on whether these foundational steps were executed with appropriate urgency. Because this case remains actively open and unresolved, the operational infrastructure for incoming information is more critical than ever. Investigative agencies and independent advocacy groups have established clear, secure channels designed to receive actionable data from the public. If you possess any documentation, photographic evidence, or direct knowledge regarding the movements of Nancy Guthrie or the individuals associated with her timeline during the critical windows of interest, you are urged to contact the dedicated investigative tepline. Information can be submitted completely anonymously through the designated Regional Crime Stoppers portal or by calling the established case tip hotline directly. To incentivize individuals who may possess vital, first-hand knowledge but have previously hesitated to come forward, a substantial financial reward remains active. This reward pool, funded through a combination of community allocations and private advocacy resources, is designated for any verified information that leads directly to the location of Nancy Guthrie or to the arrest and conviction of any individuals responsible for her disappearance. Investigators frequently point out that in cold case scenarios, financial incentives combined with the passage of time can significantly alter a witness's willingness to speak. Relationships change, alliances dissolve, and a detail that seemed minor or dangerous to reveal years ago can become the precise missing link needed to resolve a fractured timeline. As we look at the entire picture, the most rational interpretation of the available data is one of profound uncertainty, rather than proven conspiracy. We are looking at a case where the lines connecting individual accounts do not match up cleanly. It is an investigation characterized by structural friction. The names of Sheriff Nanos, Tommaso, and Annie Guthrie continue to reappear together because their individual narratives are deeply woven into the very fabric of the early timeline. They cannot be extracted from the story because their choices, their actions, and their communications occurred during the exact moments that Nancy Guthrie's physical path vanished from the public record. Investigations of this magnitude are rarely solved by a singular, theatrical confession or a sudden, dramatic twist. Instead, resolution is achieved through the quiet, methodical grind of comparative analysis. It is solved when an old document is viewed through a new lens, when a previously uncooperative witness decides to clarify a past statement, or when a piece of digital data is re-examined using advanced forensic tools that did not exist when the case was opened. Until that clarity is achieved, the timeline of the Nancy Guthrie case remains an open ledger, dependent on the persistence of investigators and the courage of those who hold the final missing pieces of information. Before we conclude tonight, we want to invite your analytical perspectives. When you review the structural overlaps, the communication patterns, and the institutional dynamics that have emerged from recent coverage, do you view them as the inevitable intersections of a localized crisis, or do you see systemic gaps in the timeline that require a fresh, independent investigation? Please share your thoughts with precision and respect in the comment section below. If you value this style of data-focused, objective true crime analysis, please ensure you have subscribed to the channel and liked this video. Your engagement helps sustain independent, research-driven documentary content. Thank you for your time, your focus, and your commitment to the facts. We will see you in the next analysis.